morning, church family. How are you all? What a great time of worship, hey, Liam? Incredible. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you for sung worship, for songs that we can sing that are just so God glorifying in the sense of His presence here today. And I feel like we just keep worshiping. But let's open the scriptures, shall we? And as you page to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I want to wish you all a very happy Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's to every one of you. I know some of you send your children to the school. They call it Agape Day. I heard someone saying that when they were at school it was called Liefde en Hartjiesdag or something like that. But Valentine's Day comes from somewhere. I don't know if you know much of the history, if you know anything about a guy called Saint Valentine. He's known in many Christian circles, and he's got sainthood. He was a man born in a city called Terni, which is about 100 or so kilometers northeast of Rome in Italy. He's a brother. You know, those of you who don't know, I'm of Italian descent, so I like Valentine. He died on the 14th of Feb, 269 AD in Rome, and he's buried in the Basilica di San Valentino Terni, Italy. Have you got it? His full name in English is Valentine of Terni. This 3rd century Roman priest, this icon, is commemorated in Western Christianity on the 14th of Feb, but in Eastern Orthodoxy on the 6th of July. So I'm going to be Russian from now on, and we're going to have 2 Valentine's Days. But from the high Middle Ages, this saint's day has been associated with the tradition of courtly love. Saint Valentine is also a patron saint of the city of Terni, of epilepsy, and beekeeping, according to Wikipedia. And it was on this day, Valentine's Day, in the year 269 AD, that Valentine was martyred for his audacious preaching of the gospel to the then emperor of Rome, Claudius. He also lost his life because he secretly married young couples who were persecuted Christians. And legend has it that he used to cut hearts out of parchment and give it to the newlyweds as a reminder of the love of God. So I'm just wondering, Adam, maybe that's something that we can start doing now. If we can find some parchment, if somebody knows where to source it, that'll be great. But there's another story that actually tells of Valentine, while he was in prison, prayed for and saw his jailer's daughter, deaf daughter, get healed. Oh, sorry, his blind daughter get healed. There's a story to this. His blind daughter was healed. And it says that he wrote her a letter, simply signed, "Your Valentine," and she could read it. So that's where it comes from. It's quite ironic and quite significant that this great archetype of romantic love was himself both single and celibate. Now I'm reminded of another character very similar to Valentine. But what strikes me is that Saint Valentine audaciously preached the gospel, and he prayed for the sick. For him, it was everyone must know. And that's the title of the message today. And that's the title of what we're going to be speaking into for the next couple of weeks. Today I want to look at another famous martyr, someone who we read about in the Bible, who also died in Rome for his faith, just a few centuries before Valentine of Terni died. You guessed it. It is none other than the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul. We meet Paul in the book of Acts in chapter 7, verse 58, where he is standing approving the stoning of another famous biblical character, a martyr by the name of Stephen. Stephen we meet in Acts chapter 6. He is one of the 7 who is appointed by the church to be a deacon, a man who is reputable amongst the people, who is full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom. And Stephen was a man who didn't just wait on tables, as we read in Acts 6, but he was a man who preached the gospel. He was intentional about making sure that everybody in Jerusalem would know about Jesus, to the point that he was persecuted, he was stoned to death, and he became a martyr. And at that moment, Paul was standing there holding the jackets of those who were stoning Stephen to death. He was known as Saul at the time, and he kind of led the charge of persecuting and murdering Christians, Jews who had come to faith in Jesus, who wanted to tell everybody about the Lord. And it was while Saul was on his way to Damascus with a letter of permission from the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem to go to the synagogues in Damascus to arrest the Christians and bind them and bring them back to Jerusalem and throw them in prison. It was on that journey to Damascus that Paul encountered Jesus. Jesus meets him in a powerful way, in a bright light that blinds Paul. And he hears Jesus speaking to him in an audible voice. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul is taken by the hand into Damascus, and he stays with a guy called Judas of Straight Street up here in Pine Slopes, no, in Damascus. And it's while he's there that God raises up another man by the name of Ananias in Damascus with a message. Go and speak to Paul. Go and speak to Saul and tell him how much he has to suffer for me, because I've commissioned him to be an apostle to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth. Ananias lays hands on Paul. Paul regains his sight, and he goes back to Jerusalem. He's persecuted. He finds a lot of trouble in Jerusalem and ends up going back to his hometown where he's born, Tarsus, and spends another 12 years there. Later on in Antioch, another city where many Christians had gone after the persecution, after the scattering of the Christians post-Stephen's stoning. They're called Christians first in Antioch because those people boldly continued to proclaim the good news about Jesus. Many people got saved. A church was planted there. And the apostles in Jerusalem send a guy called Barnabas there to go and find out what's going on. And he finds the grace of God evident in everything. And he has heard about Saul, and he goes to Tarsus, fetches Saul, brings him there, and they continue to preach the gospel. Why? Because everyone must know. And they taught the disciples. And it was in a prayer meeting when the leaders were gathered that the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul to go and do the missionary work. Saul's name changes to Paul, and he does 3 missionary trips into the known world at the time. He goes into what we know as Turkey and into Greece, and he preaches the gospel with his team, his apostolic team, on some of the islands in the Mediterranean as well. Eventually, compelled by the Holy Spirit, he is led back to Jerusalem, where he is arrested and where the Jews want to kill him. And the Lord preserves him and protects his life, but he is forced to appeal to Caesar in Rome, and that's where he ends up, in Rome, in chains, spending the last number of years preaching the gospel. He's a man who suffered. He's a man who went through a lot of difficulties as he preached the gospel, as he went about telling people about Jesus, because more than anything else, all he wanted was people to know about Jesus. In fact, he records some of his sufferings in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and from verse 25, he says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and a day adrift at sea. Imagine. I've traveled on many long journeys. I've faced danger from rivers and from robbers. I faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles. I have faced danger in the cities, in the deserts, and on the seas. And I faced danger from men who claim to be believers, but are not. I've worked hard and long, enduring many sleepless nights. I've been hungry and thirsty and have often gone without food. I have shivered in the cold without enough clothing to keep me warm. And he goes on and on. Why was he prepared to face such difficulty? Because for Paul, everyone must know. Last week, Adam kicked us off and cast the vision for this year, which is, let's say it together, everyone must know. And he shared stories of how the early church from Acts 4 and 5 were committed to making sure that everybody that they knew would know about Jesus. And Adam shared the story, the modern day parable of the orange pickers, of the orange orchard where thousands of oranges were ripening and falling off the trees, and some were beginning to rot, while on the side of the orchard were the orange pickers, singing their orange picker songs, reading their orange picker manual, hearing from the orange picker leader how to pick oranges, but they were doing absolutely nothing about it. Besides, this old lady hunched over, hurriedly picking up oranges off the ground, picking the ripe oranges off the trees, while around her thousands more oranges were just falling and beginning to rot. Paul was no lazy orange picker. He was committed to picking as many oranges as he possibly could in his life, and he suffered for it. So let's see how he lived, and let's try and discover together in a fresh way how you and I can live our lives as orange pickers today. So we're going to read from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 23, and I'm reading from the New King James Version. Paul says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win them all. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, in the new covenant, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partakers of it with you." Just very quickly, I have 5 observations from this passage that I just want to highlight in the hope that somehow the Holy Spirit takes it and just continues to impact our hearts and our minds, and that our souls just begin to embrace and draw in this vision of everybody must know, so that God can continue to work in us and stir us up to somehow maybe live a bit more like the Apostle Paul. In the context of this particular passage, and in fact of chapter 9, is that Paul is defending his right as an apostle. He's been accused by the Corinthians as being kind of a second-rate apostle because he wouldn't receive full-time support from them. He was by trade a tent maker, and he was making tents in Corinth to provide for himself and for his apostolic team. And the Corinthians were criticizing him, saying, well, you're less of an apostle because of that. And he doesn't pull up accounting arguments or anything like that, saying, this is how you should support me and this is why I need to be supported. All Paul does is he just brings it all back to the gospel again. And he writes in light of his primary calling to preach the gospel so that everyone will know. And in verse 19 he says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win them all." Paul was free to do what he wanted. Paul could do what he liked. But bringing people to Jesus was more important to him than using his freedom for selfish gain. Family, this is a big challenge for us. This really is a big challenge for us. We are free to do as we like. You are free to do as you like Paul. We live in a free country. We have religious freedom. There is no place where we cannot preach the gospel, share the good news with people in this country. But we also live in a self-centered, self-serving culture, and even we as Christians who are called by Jesus to be servants, to be other-centered, to love others as Jesus has loved us. Even us have been deceived by this culture. This liberal narrative has poisoned even us as Christ followers. You might say, well, how do you know that, Jacques? How can you even say that? Well, let's just look at how we use our God-given time and talents and treasure for a moment, shall we? Maybe I mustn't go into a whole lot of detail. Maybe this is a bit of a conviction for our hearts, for each one of us, going, we've just been singing that everything belongs to the Lord. The time that we have at our disposal, the talents, the interests, the passions, the stuff that we're born with comes as a gift from God. And the resources that we have, our treasure, the money, the finances at our disposal, how are we using it in such a way that we redeem our freedom and lock ourselves into this mission for everybody to know, that everybody would know that we use everything that we have, just like Paul, becoming servants to all, so that we might win them all. If we really want to follow Paul as he followed Jesus, I think that we need to make some life-changing calls and begin to use our freedom a whole lot more unselfishly as servants, that we might win them all. Second observation I find in verse 20. The Apostle Paul says, to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To outside observers, it might look like Paul's a little bit schizophrenic, that his life's a bit inconsistent. Jew, Gentile, this way, that way. Paul just settled down, for goodness sake. But Paul was always consistent in one goal, pursuing one goal, and it was to win people to Jesus. And he would go to great lengths. In fact, Paul is a Jew of Jews. He talks about it. He says, born to the Benjamite tribe, I'm a Jew of Jews, a scholar of the Jewish faith. That is what he was. And then he encounters Jesus and changes. But even after that, in Acts 21, we see that Paul participated in Jewish purification ceremonies. He allowed himself to go through those processes, even though they didn't apply to him anymore. They didn't matter. They weren't necessary for Paul anymore. He was born again. He was under a new covenant, no longer keeping the law in order to win God's favor and appease God and other people. But Paul chose to do that. He chose to become like a Jew so that he might win the Jews, so that he could build a bridge and begin to relate to the Jews and engage with them and minister to them about Jesus. Another example we see in Acts 16. Paul had met a young man called Timothy who was kind of half a Jew. His granny and his mom were Jews and his dad wasn't Jewish. And Timothy hadn't been circumcised as a little Jewish boy. So as an adult, Paul had Timothy circumcised. It wasn't necessary. But why did he do that? So that they could engage with the Jews. So that there would be no obstacles in the way. So that they could minister and continue to do their ministry work amongst the Jews. What about Paul's commitment to the Gentiles? Well, a theologian by the name of Pools writes this. He says, to the Gentiles, Paul behaved himself as if he himself had been a Gentile. That is, setting aside the observances of the Levitical law, to which the Gentiles had never any obligation to all. So here's Paul observing Jewish rites, going through the processes, obeying the Levitical law, as it were, and then over here he is engaging with the Gentiles, eating pork stuff. Why? Because he wants to engage with the Gentiles. Smith, another theologian, said Paul sought to win people to Jesus Christ by being sensitive to their needs and identifying with them. Smith says we should try to reach people where they are today and expect to see changes sooner or later. How do we do that? How do we do that? I can't speak for you. All of us move in different circles. All of us have different relational networks. We all live in home spaces and work spaces and play spaces and online spaces. And all of those circles are networked somehow in a wonderful way, just all relationally. How can you take what Paul says and begin to identify with people and be sensitive to their needs so that somehow you can preach the gospel to them? I can only really speak for myself and for Megan. When I came to faith in Jesus, when Jesus saved me in October 1992, I was in the Air Force. I was a military man, a soldier. And although I felt very early on in my new walk with Jesus that he was calling me into full-time ministry, it wasn't until 2010 actually that I stepped into full-time ministry. Between October 92 and December 2009, I did a lot of Air Force work, so I was full-time in the Air Force, then I did a bit of part-time work for the Air Force, and I did a little bit of full-time work as we planted another church. But most of the time, I was trying to be a soldier to the soldiers. And amazingly, by the grace of God, I had opportunity after opportunity to share the gospel with them. And today there's some who've come to faith, who are now leading churches in other parts of the world or involved in ministry somewhere else. Then when we moved to Joburg, we decided to join a gym. Megan and I became gym bunnies so that we could win the gym bunnies. And so I started gymming. It might not look like it, but in those days, I was hanging out with the gym guys. And then I started playing squash with the ones who couldn't pick up the weights as heavy as mine. And then I started running with some of the people and slowly began to build relationships. We actually started going to the gym. We would go to gym at the same time and on the same days each week so that we could meet the same people each week in a consistent way. We began to build relationships. And eventually, I started a little Friday morning Bible study in the coffee shop adjacent to the gym with a couple of the guys that I was beginning to share the gospel with. And there, we did Purpose-Driven Life with Rick Warren. I know some of you might think, Rick Warren? But he's quite good, and I think he's a nice pastor to pastor, so I like him. And we were doing that. We were doing, and Mark McClue, one of my friends who was my squash buddy and running buddy, came to faith in Jesus, got baptized later. Uncle Les, who was in his 80s, also came to faith in Jesus. He's subsequently gone to be with the Lord. But we had amazing times in those days, in the gym, talking about Jesus, becoming a gym bunny to the gym bunnies. And then also got involved with Parkrun. In 2015, I started doing the 5K Parkrun on a Saturday morning and then decided I'm going to become a volunteer in the Parkrun so that I could win volunteers. And that's where I met my friend Errol Duffett. Errol is nearly 70 years old. He reached out to me during lockdown saying, please, Jacques, I need some help. I want to talk to you about God. And last year, Errol nearly died twice. And it was the second time that he ended up in hospital at Four Ways Life in ICU that I sat with him and led him in the sinner's prayer. Not sure 100% where he is right now, but we're journeying and we're moving in that direction. And we get to see each other at least once a week. We try to. He comes here to the AA meetings and we see each other. You see, I'm not trying to boast in any way. I just want to try and be an example. I want to try and help us see the opportunities that the Lord puts in front of us. We don't necessarily need to travel to the other part of the world to tell people about Jesus. In fact, I believe with all my heart that the gospel moves most effectively in our natural circles of relationships. What's the Lord saying to you? To which Jew do you need to be a Jew? To which people are you being sensitive to and their needs? And how are you identifying with them? It's gone quiet in the room. In verse 22, Paul says, and this is the famous verse, I have become all things. Think about that for a while. All things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now, we mustn't look at this verse and think, well, Paul is kind of compromising his doctrine and his message in order to appeal to certain groups and try and be relevant. No. He denies that very, very clearly in verses 22 and 23. But Paul was prepared to change his behavior and his manner of approach when it came to connecting with people. The theologian Gordon Fee says this passage has often been looked at for the idea of accommodation in evangelism. That is, of adapting the message to the language and perspective of the recipients. Fee says this passage does not speak directly to it. This has to do with how you live or behave among those whom you wish to evangelize. Sometimes we get a bit confused and we think, I can't be like that because I'm going to compromise. No, we're not compromising the message, but we might need to adjust the way that we behave, the way that we live, the way that we engage with people that we want to win to Jesus. Clark says, let those who plead for the system of accommodation on the example of St. Paul attend to the end he had in mind. What is Paul trying to achieve here? And the manner in which he pursued that end. Again, speaking to chapter 9, it wasn't to get money, it wasn't to get influence or honor, but to save souls. That was Paul's mission. It was not to get ease or to increase his labors. No, sorry, it was not to get ease, but to increase his labors. Sorry, Clark. It was not to save his life, but rather that it should be a sacrifice for the good of immortal souls. Again, what does that look like in and through your life? What does all things to all men by all means look like to you? I kind of feel, take out your notepad and start writing things down, or take out your phone and make notes. What does that look like for you? How are you engaging with people? All means, without compromising the gospel. All men, all women, using all things at your disposal. In case the Corinthians were thinking Paul's going off on a tangent now, he brings it back in verse 23 and he says, I do all of this. I do this for the gospel's sake. For the sake of winning people to Jesus. Why? Because everyone must know. And even in this, Paul was willing to offend people over the gospel. He was willing to do that. He offended his fellow Jews. He offended Gentiles. He offended those who claimed to be Christians but weren't Christians. For the sake of the gospel, he wanted to offend them only over the gospel. And that will happen to us as well, just by the way. And I think that's often why we stop. We hold short because we don't want to offend people. We're living in a culture where we need to be respectful and all the rest. And I'm saying that's absolutely wonderful. But the reality is that when the good news is preached to some, we are the fragrance of life. To others, the smell of death. That's the reality. We need to live with that. Paul had to live with that. I remember an incident that happened a couple of years ago when we took Melissa's here this morning, took her to varsity at Tux, and she was going to res. She was a first year, a newbie, and we were taking her. We'd loaded the car with all her bags and her baggages, and off we went, and we arrived at res at Tux, and there was this group of young Christian people there who were on campus. In fact, they weren't allowed to be on campus. In fact, according to university rules and regulations, no religious group is allowed to be on campus campaigning for their church or for their faith or whatever. They had to be off campus in the streets. They weren't allowed in the grounds or anything and try and recruit people to Christianity or whatever faith they were professing. But here they were, and they were wearing these T-shirts with bold print on the front, "Save the lost at any cost." So we arrived and we were carrying bags in, and there were these young people, very friendly, very welcoming, standing in the foyer of the res. And I'm going, you're not supposed to be here. And they're grabbing people's bags and carrying them upstairs and taking fridges up the stairs and laptops and computers and microwaves and all the rest and unpacking them and hanging the girls' clothes into their cupboards. And they'd actually organized, this group had organized their church services to accommodate the anticipated thousands of students that they were hoping to gather to their services. Now guys, I'm not trying to badmouth any Christian organization. Please don't hear what I'm not saying. I think theologically we'd probably be on different pages, but on the missional front, gosh, we can learn a thing or two from these guys. They were passionate. At any cost, we're going to save the lost. And I remember Melissa actually being drawn in by the hype of the excitement of all of it and actually going to one of the services. Halfway through, she was thinking to herself, I'm not sure how clear this gospel is. But they're talking about Jesus, and just like Paul says, regardless, either way, whether it's for personal gain or out of jealousy or whatever, as long as Jesus is preached, that's fine. Preach Jesus. But she couldn't get out because they closed the doors. They wouldn't let anybody out. But Melissa had experienced something quite phenomenal, something quite significant, something of a passion from people who are committed to saving the lost at any cost. Hundreds of students came to faith. Hundreds of students were added and then discipled. Quite an incredible, incredible experience altogether. But I've got to tell you very honestly that their approach, the way they went about doing it, offended me, man. You guys break the rules. Everybody else has to stand outside. What are you guys doing in the reses, sort of thing, you know? And many others were offended. But the reason I'm telling you this story is because I want to highlight a principle here. There's a principle at play. I'm not saying, and I'm not professing, and I promise you I'm speaking on behalf of the eldership here. Don't go breaking rules. But the principle is that Paul was prepared to offend people over the gospel. Not to win any attention to himself, but because he knew that it is the rock of offense. And people will stumble over it. But many, many people will step into the glorious salvation that Jesus holds out to everybody. Because for him, everyone needed to know, at any cost to himself. Why? For the sake of the gospel. For the sake of the gospel. For the sake of the gospel. So Paul says it's for the sake of the gospel that I may be a partaker of it with you. And that invitation ripples through history all the way to today. The Apostle Paul is saying, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the gospel, I want to partake of it with you. Let's partake of it together. And the question I want to put out to each one of us is, what about you? What about us? How can we partake with Paul in this? Last week we heard from Adam that we've got ideas about how we want to engage with our wider community, with the gospel. Why? Because everyone must know. What are we going to do? We have a campus that we're about to plant sometime this year. How are we going to let the people of Bryanston know that there's another church amongst other excellent churches in Bryanston, another pot out there, an opportunity for people to come to know Jesus? And how can we use that as a way to engage with people in conversations? It might mean for some who feel you've got the courage, others are petrified by going into the mall and talking to people about Jesus and strangers. No, sorry, talking to strangers about Jesus, who's not a stranger. But I'm thinking, because Adam asked me, part of my portfolio is outreach in the church. And we're not only doing outreach into certain areas, we want to cover Bryanston and Lone Hill and wherever the Lord leads us. I'm thinking of, how can we do this? How can we leverage, for example, special days in the year? What about Easter? Mother's Day? Father's Day? Heritage Day? We can Bry. Halloween. A couple of years ago, when I was leading one of the God First congregations, we had serious debates with some people in the church because they were asking, what do we do at Halloween? And as leaders, we were going, you don't compromise the gospel. We believe that during that time, people's antenna are up, their spiritual antenna are up, and they're looking, they're wanting to know what's going on, what's happening, what's all this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of terrible stuff that happens around that from the demonic. But there are people who are innocently engaging with it and asking questions. What a great opportunity to talk to them about Jesus. Just an example. I know that's going down like a lead balloon now, but maybe later we can talk. You see, along the way, people get offended. So what? For the sake of their precious eternal souls, we will bring them the good news. And as free people like Paul, how will you see your freedom? How will you use your freedom while we have freedom? How will you change your rhythms of life for the sake of the gospel? Are you prepared to partake in Paul's sufferings and sometimes even offend people and keep going for the sake of the gospel? I'll let Charles Spurgeon, a well-known Reformed theologian, have the final word this morning. And he wrote this. It's going to be up on the screen. Spurgeon says, if sinners be damned, at least let them leap to hell over our dead bodies. And if they perish, let them perish with our arms wrapped around their knees, imploring them to stay. If hell must be filled, let it be filled in the teeth of our exertions. And let not one go unwarned and unprayed for. Why? Because everyone must know.